Berlin Recovery Workshop, Discovering New Possibilities. The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, 21st Century Research and Perspectives, including neurotheology, the science of spiritual experience. This wonderful book was co-authored by our guest today, Dr. Andrew Newberg. Let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. Newberg. Dr. Newberg is a neuroscientist who studies the relationships between brain function and various mental states. He is a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, a field known as neurotheology. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices and attitudes. Andrew is the author of the book I just mentioned, The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, 21st Century Research and Perspectives. Dr. Newberg is a doctor and professor of the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences, professor, Department of Radiology, research director, Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, PA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Newberg. Hello, Dr. Newberg.
How are you? Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to meet everyone. Looking forward to a great conversation about topics that are I'm very passionate about.
Yes, so thank you. With my very first question, because when I first read your book at the beginning, I didn't read the whole book. Great book, but I love it. I didn't get a chance to read the whole thing. What is neurotheology? Explain what that is.
Most simplistically speaking, neurotheology is the field of scholarship research that is looking at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual experiences. So that's the quick sentence of it. But I think there's some important points to be made about it, which is that, first of all, I think that when you sort of take the two sides of it, the neuro and the theology side, one thing that's very important is that people need to realize that it needs to be what I like to refer to as a two-way street. It's not just science telling us about religion. It's not religion telling us about science, but it is really the two sides of humanity. If you think about how we are as human beings and what has happened in our history, two of the primary driving forces that have led us to where we are today are science and technology on one side and religion and spirituality on the other side. So the idea of neurotheology is really to kind of use both of those forces to help us understand who we are as human beings and to try to understand the physical part of ourselves, the biological part of ourselves, as well as the psychological and spiritual part of ourselves. So I think it's important for people to realize that, even though, I know a little later on, we're going to be looking at some brain scans and things like that. So, sometimes it does feel like we're just using science to study religion, and sometimes we are. It is much more complex than that and much more nuanced than that. Another important thing that I always like to say about neurotheology as a topic, as a term, and arguably, I wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Principles of Neurotheology, and talk a little bit about, well, should we actually have called it psychospirituality or neuro-religion or something like that? And they're all okay terms. I think neurotheology has sort of stuck in large part because it just really sounds cool. And then I guess the other thing is that, I do like the idea of it as bringing together the two sides, and then also calling it an ology means that it is a field. It's a field of study and scholarship, as opposed to something like neurospirituality, which is, I'm not really sure exactly what that is. But again, this seems to be the term that has stuck. And I think the other important part about it is that the neuro and the theology side need to be defined very broadly. So the neuro side is really all the ways that we get at kind of, our brain, our mind, consciousness. So that can include neurology, psychiatry, you're looking at addictions, for example, you're looking at different, other disorders that affect the brain, looking at neuroimaging studies, as we'll talk about. So all the ways that we really get at the mind and how we sort of think about that. And that actually includes anthropology, as well as psychology. And then the theology side is also got to be pretty expanded. So theology is a discipline that looks at a given religious tradition and tries to analyze the sacred text, understand, the meaning of it. And that's all great. And that's all part of the conversation. We can look at and think about, well, what is our brain doing when we try to understand, what is the nature of free will, or what is the nature of revelation, or something like that. If a person experiences a revelatory experience, well, what about them is experiencing it? How does our brain play a role in all of that? So that's part of it. But theology also needs to be expanded, and it's not just theology proper, but it is all the ways in which we may be religious or spiritual. So that could include the performance of various practices, meditation, prayer, various rituals, the beliefs that we hold, the experiences, the varieties of spiritual experiences you mentioned in the book that we published. So all those different aspects that make us spiritual. And so I think if you kind of keep that perspective that it's a two-way street, we're not trying to eliminate science, we're not trying to eliminate religion, we're trying to understand the two of them, and we are taking a very broad view of both sides of this discussion. I think it becomes a very powerful tool. And maybe the last thing I'll say also is that part of what really excites me about it as a field is the span that it can take from the very practical to the very esoteric and back again. And so on the esoteric side, we can talk about philosophical questions, epistemology, ontology, how we think about the nature of reality and so forth. Then you get into maybe a little bit of the in-between, where we start to talk about things like what is consciousness, and how does consciousness fit in with the mind and the brain, and all those kinds of really interesting philosophical and scientifically oriented questions. And then on the very practical side, you do get about, which I know we're going to be talking about today, discussions about how does spirituality or religion intersect with our health, our well-being, and that can be our mental health, our physical health. So all the studies that have looked at the relationship between being religious or spiritual and mortality rates and cancer rates, heart disease rates, addictions, how religious and spiritual approaches might be integrated into more traditional psychotherapeutic interventions to help with, help people with different problems, depression, anxiety, PTSD, addictions, and so forth. So all of that is, to me, part of the discussion. And so, there's so much rich and diverse things for us to look at. It's a very exciting field, and we've really just scratched the surface. There is a long way to go, but I know we're going to try to talk about as much as we can today. So that's my definition. That's my explanation of neurotheology. The short one and the longer version.
That's a good one. Because when I think of that word, you have your neuro and your theology, just based on my own basic knowledge of it, I can understand those two words.
Right.
But then the way you explain it, how you have to break it down, that they actually work together and you can't leave one out, so I really like you explain.
And I think talks, part of what also is fun is how this seems to be, it affects people, and people can interact with it on many different levels. So, recently I've given a talk to a college of surgeons, and I've given a talk to the United Methodist Church. And so, there's people from all different walks of life, all different perspectives. And, but again, I think to me, one of the really important points is that, if you come at this topic from a religious or spiritual perspective, it doesn't eliminate any of the discussions that people have with regard to doctrine, with regard to sacred texts, the beliefs, theology and so forth, but it brings in a new perspective that we've never really had before. So, now if we're talking about, a question like free will, we can talk about that from the perspective of, well, what does the Bible say? What does, what do other sacred texts say? What do theologians and philosophers say? But what does science have to say about that? Is there some information about, the study of free will using a brain scan? And does that change the way we think about some of the questions and some of the ways in which we address those questions? So just it provides this new level of discussion that we haven't had before.
And that's what we like here, having a different level of a discussion.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the next part of that question. How did William James' book, The Varieties of Religious Experiences, influence the title and your work?
For those who aren't familiar, there was a very famous book that was published a little over 100 years ago by William James, who was a very well-known psychologist at the time and philosopher in many ways. He was the head of the APA and was very influential researcher and scholar. And so in about 1902, he published a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and really looked at it from a combination of psychology and even neuroscience of what they had in the day. This is now about 1900, so there was no brain scans, there was no MRI scans. I mean, we knew something about the brain, but not a whole lot. But he was kind of looking at it from that perspective, trying to understand what how we can actually think about religion and spirituality, and in many ways took a very systematic approach that had never been done before. And this, to me, in many ways, was the beginnings of neurotheology in that regard, because he was trying to look at this discussion of religion and religious experiences from a more scientifically oriented perspective. And so, he would bring up different examples of religious experiences, and he would try to categorize them, and he would talk about them. And again, and we talk about good ones and bad ones and how they affected people psychologically and in healthful ways. And so, again, he was really looking at a very integrative type of way, in spite of the fact that he was very limited by at least, the science at the time. So, but in many ways, this was really the start of people trying to explore religious experiences and thinking about them in this kind of systematic way, which to me, again, is a very exciting part of what neurotheology is about. It's about asking questions. It's about trying to explore what people are thinking and feeling. And it's not just, taking what, some great mystic said or some big theologian said, but what does the everyday person have to say about their own beliefs and the experience that they've had? So that was really seminal work that has shaped much of the research that's been done in the field over the last 120 years. And so my colleague, David Yaden, and I, and he's now a professor at Johns Hopkins University and doing a lot of work on the psychedelic front, we said, well, where have we gone in the last 120 years, and how can we try to explore that? And so we decided to name it a little bit differently to the Varieties of Spiritual Experience, with the idea that spiritual experiences is maybe just a little bit broader than religious experiences, because it can include religious, more specifically religious experiences that occur under the auspices of some specific tradition, like Judaism, Christianity, whatever. But even broadening it beyond that. And so, thinking about experiences that people have that they call spiritual, but don't necessarily link directly to a religion. And in many ways, it encapsulated a lot of the research that we've been doing over the last 30 years, which has included brain scans, it's included surveys of people's experiences, it's included a lot of research that's been done by other scholars in the area, and trying to put all of that together to help us understand what the varieties of spiritual experiences really are.
So I grew up in a church, Pentecostal church, but I had my differences early on, even when I was a little kid. But as I got older, as a teenager and adult, I always considered myself spiritual and not religious. What's the main difference between the two?
Great question. In the principles of neurotheology, the first principle I talk about is the principle of definitions. And so many of these concepts, things like spirituality, religion, soul, mind, consciousness, all of these things need to be defined. And there is no one clear way of doing it. And so part of the reason that people talk about religious and not spiritual, or spiritual not religious, is that if you actually just do a survey of 5,000 people in any given place, what you are going to find is kind of a 2x2 box where you have some reasonable number of people who will say, I am religious and spiritual. And in the United States, that's probably about 2/3. In some of the European countries, it's probably a bit less. But it makes sense, that people have a religious feeling and spiritual, they kind of go together. But then there has been certainly a growing population, again, in the United States, as well as in other places around the world, where people really struggle with a specific religious tradition. They don't really, the actual doctrinal elements don't appeal to somebody. They don't want to do prayers and rituals, or they don't adhere to all the beliefs. Maybe they don't make sense to the person, but they feel something. They feel connected to God. They feel some type of connection to other people in their community. And certainly, some higher power that's greater than the self. And so they have this feeling of spirituality without necessarily adhering to a particular religious tradition. Now, of course, to fill out the rest of the boxes, another box is people who are neither religious nor spiritual, and that tends to fall into the category of those individuals who are agnostic or atheist, where they don't really feel anything that goes beyond the person. And the one interesting thing I'll add to that is, again, it has a little bit to do with how people define certain terms. But I do think that even people who consider themselves to be atheist have certain ways of connecting to the world, connecting to something more than just their self. And whether that's through art, music, literature, being in nature, doing certain activities, being, in the mountains, being by the ocean, whatever it is, that there's, or even just humanism, of sort of connecting to people and trying to be part of, the human race, and trying to, connect us to more and more of who we are as human beings. So I think that everybody sort of has that desire to have that type of connection, even though, some people will define that as a more supernatural perspective and some not so. And then the last category there are some people, although it's usually the smallest category, who will say they are religious but not spiritual. They tend to be very dogmatic about their religious tradition. And a lot of times when they talk about spirituality in that context, they sometimes are referring to things that are more sort of occult-ish. They don't believe necessarily in like witchcraft and all that kind of thing, but they do believe in God. They just don't consider that to be spiritual or spiritualism in that regard. But this, again, the last thing I'll say in answering to your question, which I kind of throw out to everybody who's listening, is to have everybody think about how they define these terms. What does it mean to them to be religious and spiritual? Where are they the same? Where are they different? How do they overlap? When I have done that kind of exercise with students and groups, I never get exactly the same answers. And sometimes it's just fun to hear, oh, well, spirituality is the personal feeling and religion is the group feeling. And then somebody else raised their hand, well, yeah, but I go to a meditation group and we don't believe in any religious tradition, but it's spiritual and it's all a group experience. So, and then other people say, well, my religion, I do all of my prayers in my home. And so it's very personal and it's not really about the group. So you can get a lot of back and forth. It is very challenging to figure out exactly how you differentiate spirituality and religion.
Yeah, that sounds like a word cloud situation.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that, by the way, and I didn't do it.
Well, and I mean, this is even a broader point. And when we start talking about spiritual experiences, we'll come back to this, but part of what I am intrigued by are how people use words to describe these different things. And so sometimes people will say, I feel a sense of connectedness, I feel oneness, I feel spiritual, I feel love, I feel a force, I feel an energy, I feel a power. So, are they the same experiences that people just describe differently because of their language, their culture, whatever, they're just, they tend to describe it the way they do, or are they fundamentally different experiences? We don't know yet. That's a larger question for us to answer, but in and of itself, it's quite fascinating. I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening have had different kinds of experiences and have felt different kinds of things. And then the question is, and part of what we have learned through our survey of spiritual experiences, where we got about 2,000 people's responses to the question, tell us about your spiritual experience. Everybody's experience is totally unique. And yet also everybody seems to share certain elements that are common that do depend a lot on how people define those different terms and how they talk about them. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
What are some of the varieties of spiritual experiences you've encountered in your work? And as you talk about that, who can and can't have these experiences? Do you categorize them? And how does one know that they're having a spiritual experience?
Wow, well, you just asked 3 different big questions, and I'll do my best. Let me start with the how does one know it? That in and of itself is fascinating to me, because we have studied people doing various practices, prayer, meditation, and so forth. We have gotten we've done a survey of people's experiences where we, as I mentioned, we asked them to describe those experiences to us. And what to me I find intriguing is that if you kind of look at all the different experiences, there seems to be some continuum. There seems to be very mild experiences, very intense experiences. There seem to be different elements that can be mild or intense. So there's this whole variety and whole range of experiences. It doesn't seem like there's sort of this like cutoff point where we say, okay, all of these experiences, those really are spiritual experiences, and all these other experiences, those really are not. They're all spiritual experiences. But on the other hand, for the person who has that experience, there's something about it that clearly differentiates it in their mind. If you ask that any given person, did you have a spiritual experience? And they say yes. Well, there's something about that experience that, it was quantum, that quantum jump between our everyday reality that we have and that experience. And that for them, that made it something very different for them. So I don't know exactly, what specifically triggers that, or exactly, why in a given person they categorize it based on, whatever criteria they use, but they do tend to call it spiritual for a reason. And when we have looked, so now this gets into the answer to your next question, which was really your first question, I think, which is sort of about the varieties of them. So I like to think about the varieties along 2 different kinds of lines. So one of them is a little bit more based on the brain scan studies that we have done. And I know we'll talk about them in a little bit, but when we have looked at different brain scans of people doing spiritual practices, we ask them, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you experiencing? And then we try to match up those feelings and experiences with what we're seeing on the brain scans. So that was part of why we undertook this other project to do a survey of spiritual experiences, because we felt like we needed to have a more thorough understanding of what these experiences were all about for people. And so when we looked at these about 2,000 different experiences, as I mentioned, there could be lots of different words that are used. But ultimately, when we used what's called a content analysis, we were able to group words into certain basic categories. And we came up with the idea that there are kind of 5 core elements. And I hope that these resonate with everyone who's listening. So here are the 5 core elements that essentially are part of almost every experience, or at least several of these are part of every experience. And in many ways, most of them are. So one of them, and this is not in any particular order, but one of them is a sense of unity. So it could be a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness, a feeling of the oneness of yourself with God. It could be the sense of oneness of all things. But there's a sense of unity. So in our everyday reality, there's me and the world, but in these spiritual states, we feel that we connect with something in a very, very profound way that we have never done before. And so that feeling of unity is, to me, one of the core elements of these experiences. The next core element that I talk a lot about is a feeling of intensity. So what I mean by that is that there's something about, it goes back to the last question I was just answering, which is there's something unusual about the experience. It is much, much more intense than anything we have ever felt before. Now, what is more intense? It could be a lot of different things. It could be an emotion. It could be the greatest feeling of love that you have ever felt. It could be the most beautiful visual imagery that you have ever seen. It could be the greatest feeling of energy, bliss, whatever it is. But it's not just bliss. It's not just a sense of arousal or bliss or unity. It is more profound than anything we've ever felt before. So that sense of intensity is a part of these experiences. And we can talk about the brain areas that are involved in each of these a little bit later. There's a sense of clarity. And this is where people feel that the proverbial veil has been thrown off them, and they are now seeing the world in a way that they never had before. And so, and whether that is a religious revelation, whether I understand it's time, I need to be Christian, or I need to, be spiritual in this particular way, whether it's, I understand myself, I know who I am now, I get it. But it's that, I've got it now, I understand. And I now know the world, and I know myself in a way that I never had before. So that sense of clarity. The fourth one is a sense of surrender. And this is a very powerful part of these experiences. And what we mean by that is that that when the person is having the experience, when you do a practice like meditation or prayer, you sit down to do it. And so you feel like you are doing the meditation. You say, I am meditating. And as you meditate and or pray or whatever it is that you're doing, if you start to get into these spiritual experiences, at some point, it feels like you're not the one making it happen, but it is something that is happening to you. And as it happens to you, you kind of have two choices. You can kind of, fight it off if you try, but eventually you sort of surrender to it and you kind of let it happen and you let it take you over. So sometimes it's described as a feeling of release, letting go, surrender, again, different terms, but basically you're not making it happen. You are along for the ride and it's happening to you. So that's the fourth core element. And then the fifth core element is what I usually refer to as a feeling of transformation, that you are now changed as the result of this experience. It has changed you spiritually, ideologically, whatever it's done, you're a different person now, and from what you were before. And so something has changed in you, and this transformative element is also a very powerful and important part of the experiences. So those are the core descriptions of what happens to people. But then we also looked at all of these experiences, and we did a different kind of analysis called a factor analysis to see which ideas, which terms kind of group together, and does it tell us about the content of these experiences. And when we do that, we came up with three basic categories of these experiences. One of them is called, that we refer to as the numinous type of experience. And that is where you are connecting to a higher power, God, the divine, universal consciousness, something along those lines. And within that big category are several smaller ones. One is the numinous experience, which is where you really feel like you have come in contact with God or something divine. Another subcategory of that are revelatory experiences. So you didn't necessarily come in contact with God, but you feel that something was given to you, some information was given to you. And then the third are what we call synchronicity experiences, where something happens in your life that was very serendipitous, but you feel like the only way that happened was because there was something, some being who was basically enabling that to happen in some way, kind of controlling the world and the universe around you. So those are the numinous experiences. Then the next category are what we refer to as the mystical experiences. These are typically experiences of unity, of self-loss, so to speak. And so you might feel an intimate connection, a unity with God, for example, a unity with the universe. But basically, you're kind of losing yourself, and you might get to like an absolute unitary being kind of experience where you basically, everything is one. And that's kind of the famous, term to become one with everything, so to speak. But also in this category are aesthetic experiences. And it goes back to my point I made a little earlier about people who are agnostic or atheist, that they can still have very powerful aesthetic experiences that can be natural, or they can be more artistic and creative. And so both of those are subcategories of the mystical types of experiences. And then the last category are what we refer to as the paranormal experiences. And so the paranormal experiences, not surprisingly, this is where people are getting into contact or experiencing something supernatural. It could be angels, spirits, it could be negative things, it could be demons or whatever, but it's some being or object that is supernatural, but and something that they can't understand or figure out in any particular way. And those are differentiated into one of two broad categories, which are paranormal experiences that are known to you versus unknown. So known experiences would be, seeing the ghost of your grandparent or your child or something, something that personally. And then the other is the unknown. So it's just, some random spirit or some random angel or something like that you don't really have any personal connection with, but you're perceiving it or experiencing it. So those are it's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but very, very important part of it, which is, the nature of these spiritual experiences and the core elements of the experiences and the basic categories that help us to take, several thousand experiences and really try to group and categorize them. And what's also exciting for us is that, and I know we'll talk about this in a few moments, but that a lot of these ideas, the feelings of unity, clarity, and so forth, they can be traced to various areas of the brain's function and what's going on during the practices that we've observed in our research. So that was, we really tried to go in with kind of a blank slate, even though I had some, personal hopes of what I would see. But this all fell out of the content analysis, so we weren't really guiding it, so to speak. And it was helpful to see how the different categories fell out from that analysis, so that it helps us to understand even more the brain studies that we've done over the years.
What are SPECT images? And I'm going to share my screen.
So, part of what's very exciting and part of what has really propelled the field of neurotheology over the last 25, 30 years has been the ability to do brain scan studies that we've never been able to do before. Up until the last 25, 30 years, if somebody had a spiritual experience or did some kind of practice, there's not much that we could do to explore what was going on biologically. But now there's a lot. And so a lot of our research has been done with SPECT imaging. So SPECT is a technical term. It stands for single photon emission computed tomography. There you go. And what that basically means, single photon emission, means that you inject some kind of radioactive material that emits a single photon, and then you do a three-dimensional rendering of the brain or body to see where it went. And so what's exciting about these kinds of studies is that we can inject a variety of different types of tracers that can help us to understand what's going on in the brain. So some of these tracers help us to look at blood flow. Some actually help us to look at different neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And so they give us a very important functional picture of the brain. And so, we've done a lot of work with SPECT imaging. One of the reasons why we have also used SPECT imaging is that it has a unique aspect to it, which makes the study of spiritual practices and experiences a little easier. So, another approach that's frequently used in today's work and literature are functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, fMRI studies. Now, they're great as well. The downside of an MRI study is that you have to be in the scanner when you are studying whatever it is that you're studying. So you'd have to actually be doing a practice like meditation or prayer in the scanner, which, for any of you who have had an MRI know that, it's a very tight space and there's a lot of noise. It's very distracting. As I always joke, on one hand, it's very hard to pray. On the other hand, a lot of people like to pray while they're in there. But it does give you some very, very good images of how the brain is operating. The advantage of the SPECT imaging is that we can set the individual up who's going to participate ahead of time. We put an IV catheter in their arm, and then when they start to do the practice, then at some point when they're deep in the practice, I come in and I inject through this IV that's going kind of away from them. So I'm not really near them or interfering with what's going on. I just inject a little bit of this radioactive material. They don't feel it. It doesn't make them, it doesn't change anything, but it gets into their body, it gets into their brain. And then what's really unique about these radioactive tracers that we're looking at that look at blood flow, part of why that works is that blood flow corresponds with brain activity. So the more you're using a certain part of the brain, the more blood flow it gets. The less you're using it, the less blood flow it gets. So it's a good marker of activity in the brain. It's quantifiable, which is nice. So we get statistics as well as just looking at the pictures. And but again, what's really important is that once it circulates and gets up into the brain, it essentially gets locked into the brain for a period of time. It goes through a little metabolic process. So the radioactivity basically sits in the brain until it decays. And that means that if I were to inject one of you right now, and then we finished the talk, and then maybe you had a little something to eat, and then you went over to your local hospital and you got into the SPECT scanner, it would tell me what your brain was doing right now at the time of the injection. So it captures a snapshot of the brain at a given moment. And Teresa, you had mentioned being brought up in the Pentecostal tradition. I forget if we have these pictures here, but we did a study of speaking in tongues. And of course, there's no way you could study speaking in tongues in an MRI scanner because the people are moving around, they're they're making these vocalizations, a lot of things are going on, and there's no way you would get any kind of decent picture of the brain. But we could have them standing and moving around and speaking in tongues. Then I would, when they finally started speaking in tongues, I could inject them. They finished speaking in tongues, and then I put them into the scanner, and it told me what their brain was doing when they were speaking in tongues. So this gives us this really wonderful opportunity to get to capture a snapshot of the brain. And so now, to this particular slide, the colors represent the activity. So the way I have the color scheme set up, and there's lots of different color schemes, but for this one, the red areas are the most active, followed by the yellow, the blue, and the black. And the top of the scan, the top of the brain image there is actually your frontal lobe. So it's as if you're looking at the person as if they're lying down. And so you're looking at them up from their feet. So the very top where I listed the attention area, that's the frontal lobe, which is right behind your forehead. The bottom of the scan is the back of the brain, and then you have the left and the right. So this was a cute little study that we did. It was an N of 1, as we would say. It was one subject, so take it with a grain of salt, but it was kind of fun. I had a colleague of mine who apropos of our prior conversation about spirituality versus religious, felt very spiritual, was a very avid meditator, but did not believe in God, did not believe in a particular religious tradition. And so we said, well, how would you like to come in and instead of meditating on your typical, object of meditation, why don't you meditate on an image of God, on thinking about God? And they said, sure, let's do that. So what we see, and we always sort of have to have a comparison state. So we have like some kind of resting state, which is the baseline state. And then we had them while they were contemplating God. And if you look at the frontal lobes, what you see is that the frontal lobe area that's listed as the attention area started out kind of red and was kind of about the same, maybe a little less red, but not much. Didn't really change very much. And that's interesting because in a lot of our studies where people are very purposefully meditating on something that they feel has a great deal of meaning for them, their frontal lobe activity goes way up. Of course, when they ultimately have an experience of surrender and they kind of release their concentration, then their frontal lobe activity drops. But here, it really didn't do much of anything. And I think one of the take-home messages of this particular study is that whatever you do, it's important that you buy into it, so to speak, that you do believe it. If you're just saying a prayer for the sake of saying a prayer, it really isn't going to change your brain very much. But if you're saying a prayer because you deeply believe in it, it's a part of who you are, it's a part of your belief system, then it is something that's going to be very meaningful for you. And we've done studies where, we've actually had people just recite a prayer, and then we had them really do the prayer, and it's very, very different. So, it's not just going through the motions, so to speak, but you really have to engage it. Now, this study is a study from a small study we did of a group of Franciscan nuns doing a kind of Christian prayer called centering prayer. I should parenthetically add that we've studied virtually every tradition, at least the major traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism. We've studied Brazilian mediums. We've studied mindfulness. We've studied loving kindness meditation. So, there's, and of course, there's thousands of different types. So, when I finally get my $1 billion grant, I'll have an opportunity to look at all of these things. But until then, I do the ones that I can find and that I can get a little funding for. But anyway, so this was a group of Franciscan nuns doing a kind of prayer called centering prayer, where they focus on a prayer, on some phrase of the Bible, a prayer that they don't repeat so much as really just kind of meditate on it and pray about it. And they feel very deeply connected to God is one of the main things that they talked about. So, and that's really that sense of unity, that sense of oneness that we talked about earlier as one of the core elements of these experiences. So if you look at the back of the brain, and this is kind of the upper back part, which is where what's called the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe normally takes sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self. It helps us to establish where we are spatially in the world. And so one of the things that we have always proposed in our research is that that when people have a profound sense of oneness or unity, lose the differentiation between their self and the world, that this parietal lobe actually starts to quiet down, so that when it turns on, you get your feeling of your sense of self. And then when you lose that sense of self, this is an area of the brain that begins to shut off. And that's exactly what you see here in the prayer state, with this orienting area of the brain. In the baseline state, you see a lot of reds, and then in the prayer state, you see a lot of yellows. I see your cursor there, so that's perfect. And so it goes from a lot of red to a lot of yellow, and that is very consistent with this decrease of activity in the parietal lobes and that sense of oneness that that so many people talk about during these different practices. So if you want to go on to the next one, I forget what the...
Well, the thing is, we have about 10 minutes before we want to
open
it up for questions.
Some questions.
And I definitely want to get to some of the next questions.
Sounds good. Well, just to wrap up, the important point is that these different areas of the brain that we can look at seem to be involved in these experiences. And part of what we have learned over the years, and hopefully this isn't a surprise to anybody, is that that there isn't one part of our brain that is the spiritual part, that there are many different parts of the brain, and it really does depend a lot on what the experience is. And so there, when there's, from my perspective, there's a whole network of structures that are part of these experiences. And it depends a lot on, did you visualize something? Well, if you did, then it was your visual areas of the brain. Did you hear something? Did you think something? What emotions did you have? We haven't really talked about that, but there's the limbic system, which are part of the emotional centers of our brain. And they turn on when people have very powerful emotional experiences, the intensity that we were talking about earlier. So depending on what one does and how one does it and what one experiences, we see this very complex network of brain structures that get involved that really help the person to connect with the spiritual experience. And of course, since the brain is deeply connected to the body, you not only feel it in your brain, so to speak, but you feel it in your body as well. And so you'll feel your heart, you'll feel your stomach, the energy in your body, whatever it is, you feel something very, very powerful that's not just in your mind, but in your body as well.
Thank you so much for that. I definitely have a better understanding of it, especially the way you explained it. So This topic has come up quite a bit, even with some other speakers that we've had in this meeting. And I know that your co-author, David?
Yeah, David Yaden. Mhm.
Yaden, yes, that he's probably doing more on this topic, but have you done research on how psychedelic drugs might prompt or help people to have spiritual experiences?
Yeah, so I personally have not been involved in that research, although there's a lot of very fascinating research that's going on right now. However, we were able to publish an article about that based on our survey, because one of the questions that we asked people in our survey was, under what circumstances did you have your experience? And when we looked at the people who had these experiences under the influence of various psychedelic compounds, they met all of the same basic criteria. They were very much as real for them spiritually as the more, quote unquote, natural or spontaneous kinds of experiences, or the prayer-induced experiences. So, so these are experiences that, seem to be able to, people are able to have in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different settings. And the psychedelics are another approach that can be taken. Obviously, as a physician, I'm waiting to see the data. I want to, as one of my old colleagues, used to refer to the coinage in the United States, in God we trust, but otherwise show me the data. And so, we need to know a little bit more about the safety of it. And whether it can be useful, especially in people who may already have had a history of substance abuse or something like that. But there's a lot of research that's being done. And part of what I think, and this may be another way of answering your question, to me, neurotheology is a big jigsaw puzzle. There are lots of different pieces that we need to look at. And so there are the psychedelic experiences that people have. There are near-death experiences. There's the dark night of the soul type of experiences that many people with substance abuse have dealt with and have had their experiences through. There are people who have psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, or neurological disorders like temporal lobe epilepsy, who have had these unusual experiences. Of course, there's people who have them during meditation and prayer. And then there's people who have them spontaneously. And so, there's lots of different ways that these experiences can happen. And it actually just reminded me of one of the other questions that you would ask that I actually didn't answer, which is that, to me, one of the big take-home messages of all the work that we have done and the surveys that we've seen is that these experiences are not just, for the guru sitting on a mountaintop, but they really can happen to anyone, and they can happen to everyone. And that, to me, is very exciting. I mean, you look at when we did our survey, we got people's, their ages, genders, their religious and spiritual backgrounds, whether they had medical conditions, psychological conditions, we asked all kinds of questions about who they were, and it's all over the place. And this was an international, at least about 15% of the people that we got on our survey, because it was online, were from, people outside of the United States. So, around the world, around all the traditions were represented. So, anyone can have these experiences, and everyone can have them. And that, to me, is what's exciting about that.
Okay. So I'm going to decide with this. So William James claimed that it isn't the origin of the conversation or spiritual experience that matters, but rather the fruit of the spiritual tree. Now, I know what that means because I've been listening to a whole lot of stuff. What does that mean, and do you agree with that?
I do agree with it partially. The basis of what he's talking about is that a little bit of what I was just talking about. I mean, when you talk about the jigsaw puzzle, these experiences can come from a lot of different, come at people in a lot of different ways. What's important is the experience itself and how it does transform the individual. And so, one of the things that we did ask people about was the transformative aspect of these experiences. And what was fascinating to me was that, 95% of people view these experiences positively. They have a positive effect on their relationships, on their sense of health and well-being, their sense of meaning and purpose in life. It reduces their fear of death. And they certainly have far more connection to their spiritual selves as the result of these experiences. So in that sense, the fruits of these experiences can be very, very powerful and very transformative. And to some degree, regardless of how the experience occurred, it does have that transformative effect. So I agree with that in that context. But there's two caveats to that. One caveat is that that part of the answer, or part of the thing that we've also noticed, is that in spite of the fact that maybe 90–95% feel it is a positive experience, there is a percentage of people, albeit small, maybe 3 to 5%, who will say it didn't go well. And whether that is the proverbial bad trip, whether it is a very positive experience that was so overwhelming, but then confusing to the person that they didn't know how to integrate it into their way of believing about the world or their tradition, whether it created struggles between themselves and their family members or their religious communities. So there's a lot of times where these experiences can go wrong. And to me, that's a big area for neurotheology to move into in the future, which is what's the difference in the brain of somebody who has a very positive experience that transforms them in great and positive ways versus someone who has an experience that doesn't go so well for them. And what was going on? Was it the experience? Was it the baseline of the person? So there's a lot of interesting challenges for us to think about in terms of that. And then the second caveat is actually probably a little bit more on the esoteric side of things, which is that my own personal reason for getting involved in all of this had a lot to do with my own kind of philosophical investigations about the nature of reality, how we view reality, which took a scientific approach. But also I realized, the limitations of science and the need to explore things philosophically and theologically as well as scientifically, which is in many ways what led to this, my interest in the whole perspective of neurotheology. So, I don't know if the fruits inherently answer our questions about the true nature of these experiences and the realness of them. That is a little bit more complex of a philosophical question that I still have, to me, is still one of the most important core questions of all of what neurotheology is about, and certainly what my work is about. So just because there's a good outcome doesn't inherently mean that it represents a real reality. That if somebody changes their life around because they believe, they had an experience of God, that's great, and that is fantastic. And in that regard, I applaud that experience to the fullest. But it doesn't inherently prove that God exists just because they had that experience. And it works for the person, and which again is great. But when we get into some of these really big questions about the nature of reality, it becomes far more challenging. And part of neurotheology is asking us to do is to just be careful about how we, answer, how we conclude about the different studies that we do. And maybe my last little cute story to say is that when we did the study, for example, of the Franciscan nuns that we looked at, and I showed her brain, she was very appreciative. Thank you, Dr. Newberg. This is great. It shows me that God exists and tells me, and how God interacts with me through prayer. And I said, you're welcome. And off she went, and she was very happy. And then I got when we published our data, I got a call from the head of the local atheist society. And he said, Dr. Newberg, I just wanted to thank you for proving that, once and for all, that religion is nothing more than the phenomena in the brain and that there is no God. And I said, you're welcome. And off they went, and they were happy. So there was some, cosmic yin and yang balance between making a nun happy and an atheist happy at the same time. But the point of that story is that, people have to be careful about, exactly what they do with the information. But I think there's still a lot of very practical information, especially when you're talking about things like the use of spiritual and religious ideas and concepts in helping people deal with psychological conditions like substance abuse, depression, anxiety, PTSD. That it can be very, very helpful, especially when religion and spiritual issues have gotten kind of wrapped up in the process for that individual. Obviously, it may not be appropriate for somebody who is a true, profound atheist and they don't really want to have anything to do with it. But for people who do have a religious or spiritual background, Sometimes that can be very important for them to engage that side of themselves as part of the healing process. And that's certainly, a very part of your community. And again, to me, it just makes so much sense. And I think the data supports that. But again, there's some really big philosophical questions that have yet to be answered.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newberg. I have to say that the Common Core terms, and we didn't talk about the big E and the little e, but that might come up,
Okay.
when people ask questions. But
I'll address it, sure.
Yeah, definitely you want to address that, because I have a couple of examples of it just myself, with the understanding of it. But when you talk about the, trying to find it on my thing here, the Common Core, the unity, in no particular order, like you said, surrender, permanence, clarity, and I'm missing one.
Intensity, I think.
Intensity, okay. Yeah. When I first read that, it sounds like how we work our 12 steps. Yeah. And what happens in the whole process of us working our 12 steps, how we interact with each other, how we have to be clear in what we say, and we try to definitely keep anonymity. All of it is, a form of unity, and so much more with that. So thank you so much once again for your time. Now, this is the time that we are going.
Let me appreciate what you were just saying, because part of how religious and spiritual traditions work, part of how 12-step programs work, is to develop that a kind of ritualistic approach. And rituals are so powerful for us as human beings. Some of my early work was really designed to look at the effect of rituals on the brain, and in many ways it kind of helps to codify those elements in a way that works for people. And so that I think it's great to hear you say that, because I think it makes a lot of sense, and it really is a way of trying to take these core elements and make them accessible to people in a consistent way, in a way that works for them, and so that they can engage it in an effective way that winds up being able to have the ultimate goal of the transformative effect that helps them to deal with the issues that they're facing.
Right, and I think that I've had so many spiritual awakenings just being a part of the 12-step program, where my life has permanently changed. There is some permanence in this experience, but the biggies are a little bit different. All right, so thank you, Dr. Newberg. We are